Hello, friends. Before we begin, this story doesn't start where you think it does. Have you ever stood at the edge of a canyon at night and felt like the dark was standing back? Out here, the land doesn't end. It just falls away, stone carved by centuries of wind. Silence, so deep it presses against your ears. During the day, it's beautiful. At dusk, it's unsettling. And after midnight, it becomes something else entirely. If you've ever driven through a place like this, or even wondered what waits beyond the places marked restricted, pay attention. And if you haven't listened closely, my name is Thomas Yazzie, and I served 14 years with Navajo Tribal Police, assigned to the Western Canyon districts near Black Mesa. Most people think law enforcement is about rules and reports. Out here, it's about survival. On average, there was one officer for every 72 square miles. No backup, no streetlights, just radio static and prayer. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong. There are things I've learned that don't exist in manuals, things we aren't trained to recognize, and things that will never appear in an official report. I've been advised not to talk about this, not because it's classified, but because no one wants the responsibility of knowing it's real. I'm breaking that silence now because the land doesn't forget, and neither do I. I was a senior patrol officer when the canyon call came in, not a missing hiker, not vandalism. Just a single sentence from dispatch that still makes my hands shake. Something's wrong out there, and it won't stop calling. If you've ever worked a job where instinct mattered more than protocol, you already understand why I didn't ask questions. I just drove. That night forced me to choose between procedure and people, between what I was sworn to uphold and what I was warned never to approach. I carry that choice with me, every day, and once you hear what we found, you'll understand why I've never gone back. The road into the canyon wasn't really a road anymore, just a suggestion left behind by tires that knew where they were going. After I left the last cluster of houses behind, the headlights stopped catching fences and signs and started falling into nothing. The land opened up the way it always does out there, not suddenly, but patiently, like it's been waiting for you to notice how small you are. This part of the reservation sits on a network of canyons that don't show up clearly on most maps. They branch and overlap like veins, carved slowly by water that only comes a few times a year, but comes with purpose when it does. The stone walls are layered in reds, browns, and chalky grays, each band marking a different age. Some of those layers were already ancient before the first people ever walked through them. Others are still shifting, shedding rock after storms, changing the land just enough that a familiar path can become unfamiliar overnight. Weather behaves strangely here. Storms don't roll in so much as they appear, clouds stacking silently against the canyon rims until the air feels heavy and wrong. Wind funnels through narrow passages and comes back out somewhere else, carrying sounds with it. You can hear a gust on your left and feel it hit your back. Rain can fall on one side of a ridge while the other stays dry and dusty. Out here, nothing moves in straight lines, not water, not air, and I would eventually learn not time. For the Navajo people, this land isn't scenery. It isn't a backdrop for stories or a resource to be managed. It's a witness. It has memory. That doesn't mean it's worshipped. And it doesn't mean every shadow hides a legend. It means you behave differently when you understand that the ground beneath your feet has seen generations come and go, mistakes repeated, warnings ignored, consequences paid quietly. No one ever sat me down and explained this formally. There's no handbook section on respect. You learn it by listening and by noticing who goes quiet when certain places are mentioned. You learn it by watching elders pause before answering questions, choosing words carefully, or choosing not to use them at all. Some warnings aren't meant to be written down. They pass from person to person the way you pass along directions that only make sense if you've already been there. A look, a shake of the head, a phrase that sounds harmless unless you know the weight behind it. That area isn't for us. Best to turn back before dark. The land there listens more than it speaks. As an officer, you're trained to separate superstition from fact. As a Navajo officer, you learn that separation isn't always clean. Respect doesn't require belief. It requires restraint. There were places we responded to calls reluctantly, Not because we feared them, but because we understood them enough to be cautious. That night, as I drove deeper into the canyon system, I felt that caution settle in my chest like a physical thing. The radio crackled intermittently, never fully cutting out, but never sounding quite right either. Dispatch repeated the location twice, then corrected it again. Each time, the coordinates shifted slightly, as if the point itself refused to stay still. I checked my watch after what felt like 20 minutes of driving and realized nearly an hour had passed. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't sped up. The road just kept unfolding. Sound behaved oddly, too. The engine noise didn't echo the way it should between canyon walls. Sometimes it sounded muffled, like I was driving through deep snow instead of hard-packed dirt. Other times, I could swear I heard something behind me. Footsteps, maybe, only for the sound to jump ahead of the vehicle when I slowed down, as if it had taken a shortcut through the rock. I told myself it was fatigue. Long shift will do that to you. If you've ever pushed through a warning sign because it wasn't official, because no one put in writing or said over radio, you know how easy it is to rationalize discomfort. You convince yourself that experience is the same as immunity. It isn't. I thought about Eli Begay then, the way I often did when something didn't sit right. Eli was a senior ranger, older than most of the officers on the force, with a face weathered by sun and wind, and a voice that rarely rose above a calm, even tone. He'd been working these lands since before I pinned on a badge. First as a ranger, then as a quiet advisor everyone claimed not to rely on until they did. Eli didn't tell stories. He told observations. If he warned you away from a place, it wasn't because of something he believed, but because of something he'd seen. He was also careful about what he shared, especially with reports. Not everything needs a file, he once told me, tapping a finger against his temple. Some things just need memory. A year before that night, we'd been posted together near another canyon after a hiker went missing. The search turned up nothing. No tracks, no gear, no remains. Just absence. When the operation was finally called off, Eli stood at the edge of the canyon and closed his eyes, like he was listening for something. When I asked him what he thought happened, he waited a long time before answering. The land kept him, he said finally. Not took. Kept. Eli retired 6 months later. They said it was his knees. He said it was time. Remembering him as I drove, I felt that same sense of being observed, not in a threatening way, but in a patient one, like the land wasn't rushing me toward anything. It was letting me come on my own. My headlights swept across a weather sign half buried in sand. No lettering remained, just a rusted frame and a single post leaning at an angle. Whatever warning it once carried had been stripped away by time or deliberately removed. I slowed down, scanning the area, trying to reconcile the emptiness with the growing pressure behind my eyes. Then the radio clicked on. For a moment, I thought I heard my name. Not called sharply, not with urgency, but spoken the way someone does when they're checking if you're still listening. I answered out of reflex. No response came back. Just static, then silence heavy enough to make my ears ring. I checked my watch again. Another gap. Another stretch of time I couldn't account for. Ahead, the canyon widened into a basin I didn't remember from previous patrols. The rock formations looked familiar, but their arrangement felt wrong, like furniture moved in a room you know well. At the far edge of the basin, my headlights caught a series of posts driven into ground in a loose arc. No signs, no markings, just posts, spaced evenly, some newer than others. I stopped the vehicle. I knew then why the call had felt wrong, why the coordinates wouldn't settle, why dispatch kept hesitating. This wasn't a place meant to be approached directly. It was a place meant to be skirted, respected from a distance, left alone unless there was no other choice. Eli's voice came back to me, uninvited but clear. There are areas we don't name, he'd said once. Not because they're secret, because names make people curious. As I stepped out of the truck and looked at those unmarked posts, I understood something I hadn't before. I had crossed into an exclusion zone, and nothing had told me to stop. I didn't cross those posts right away. I stood there with the engine idling, headlights washing over bare stone, tried to decide whether this was already a violation or just the edge of one. Dispatch hadn't cleared the location. They hadn't warned me away either. All I had was a call that didn't sit right, and a stretch of land that felt like it was holding its breath. I got back into the truck and radioed in again, slower this time, asking for confirmation. The response came late, like someone had waited to see if I would change my mind. The dispatcher repeated the same phrase I'd heard before, word for word, cadence unchanged, as if it were being read from a loop instead of spoken by a person. When I asked for the reporting party's name, there was a pause long enough for static to build. Then the answer came back wrong. Not incorrect exactly, just incomplete. A first name with no last. When I asked again, the first name repeated, identical in tone and timing, like a recording dropped back into place. Dispatch procedure is built on redundancy. You verify, you log, you confirm again. Every call leaves a paper trail, even the false ones. But this call resisted that process. Each time I tried to pin it down, it slipped sideways, answers bending just enough to avoid becoming solid. I should have pulled back then, marked the coordinates as questionable, waited for a supervisor. That's what protocol says. But protocol assumes the system itself is functioning. Out here, sometimes the system is just another voice echoing through rock, pretending to know where you are. That was when another unit checked in. Officer Lena Morales. Temporary assignment. Transferred in from Flagstaff to cover a staffing gap we hadn't been able to fill for months. She sounded alert, professional, and unaware of the tension crawling up my spine. I briefed her quickly, sticking to facts, leaving out the parts one couldn't explain. She asked the right questions, including whether dispatch had confirmed the call. I hesitated before answering. That hesitation said more than any report ever could. Lena offered to approach from the south access road, the one that skirts the canyon rim before dropping down. It was a safer route, longer but visible. My route cut straight through the basin and into the narrow corridor beyond the posts. 2 paths, 1 decision. While we coordinated, the radio cut in again on its own. The same first name, the same cadence. But this time it added something new, a pause in the middle of the phrase, like it was listening for a response before finishing the thought. Lena heard it too. She didn't comment right away, but her breathing changed, audible through the mic. When she finally spoke, she asked if the radio delay had been an issue lately. I told her the truth. Only tonight. The moral weight settled in then. If this was a system error, pushing forward put us at risk unnecessarily. If it wasn't, turning back meant abandoning whoever had made that call, however strange it sounded. Law enforcement teaches you to prioritize life. It doesn't tell you how to define it when the lines blur. I told Lena to hold position at the rim until I confirmed conditions below. It wasn't order so much as a request framed like one. She acknowledged, but I could hear the reluctance. None of us liked waiting when something felt wrong. As I rolled forward, the radio began to lag behind my movements. I'd turn the wheel, then hear the faint sound of gravel a second later through the speaker, as if the truck itself was reporting its actions after fact. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, impossible to ignore once noticed. The basin narrowed ahead, walls closing in, shadows stacking on shadows. My headlights caught the first bend of the restricted corridor, a passage too tight for comfort, too deliberate to be accidental. I radioed Lena with my position. The reply came back in my own voice. It said exactly what I just said, same inflection, same hesitation. Then it went silent. I stopped breathing without realizing it, hand tightening on the steering wheel. Somewhere behind me, a sound echoed that wasn't the engine and wasn't the wind. I keyed the mic again, forcing my voice steady, and told Lena I was proceeding with caution. She responded normally this time, but the delay stretched longer than before, words arriving like they had to travel a greater distance than they should. The corridor waited ahead, darker than the surrounding rock, swallowing light instead of reflecting it. I eased forward, knowing that once I entered, turning around would be harder than continuing. The call that shouldn't exist had led me here. I thought again about protocol, about how many times it had protected me, and how many times it had failed people who needed help quickly. Every policy is written with daylight in mind. Very few account for places like this, but the land itself seems to interfere. If you've ever trusted a system because it was there, not because it felt right, you understand the trap. I was inside it now, moving forward because stopping felt worse than whatever waited ahead. The radio crackled once more, softer this time, like it didn't want to be noticed. A fragment of sound slipped through, not words, just breath. I didn't answer. I crossed the threshold into the corridor, canyon walls tightening around the truck. The world reduced to rock, shadow, and the hum of an engine that suddenly felt very small. Behind me, Lena's unit remained a distant presence, a safety line I wasn't sure would hold. Ahead, the passage bent out of sight, drawing me deeper into a place that had already proven it could bend voices, time, and judgment. I adjusted my lights, checked my mirrors, and took one last look back at the basin before it disappeared behind rock. Whatever had made that call wanted me here, and I was close enough now to feel the pull of it, steady and patient, guiding me forward into the restricted canyon corridor. The radio stayed silent as I advanced, silence stretching like a hell breath, and I knew the next transmission, if it came, would change everything. I kept driving, aware that protocol was behind me now, and whatever waited ahead would not respect badges, radios, or rules written for safer places like this narrow stretch of stone, with a land closing around. Once I was inside the corridor, the world simplified in a way that felt deliberate. Rock walls pressed close enough that the headlights barely spread before being swallowed. The sky narrowed to a ribbon overhead. The radio stayed quiet, and for the first time since the call came in, that silence felt heavier than static. There are rules you learn in law enforcement that never make it into training manuals. They're passed along the same way trail knowledge is passed in the canyon. Quietly, person to person, usually after something has gone wrong. Long-serving officers don't call them rules. They call them habits. Things you do without thinking, because thinking about them too hard means admitting why they exist. One of the first is knowing what not to log. Not every anomaly belongs in a report. Strange delays get labeled as signal interference. Missing time becomes fatigue. If you write down everything that doesn't make sense out here, the paperwork never ends, and neither do the questions. Worse, you start drawing attention to places that are better left undescribed. Another rule is knowing when not to pursue. Tracks that stop suddenly. Voices that call from places no one could be standing. Calls that loop back on themselves without resolution. You're taught to follow leads, but you're also taught officer safety. Out here, those two principles sometimes contradict each other, and experience teaches you which one to prioritize if you want to come home. The last unspoken rule is the hardest, knowing what not to acknowledge. Some things gain weight when you name them. Some patterns become more insistent once you recognize them. Veterans learn to let certain moments pass without comment, to accept that not every question needs an answer, and that insisting on one can make the situation worse. I didn't learn these rules in the academy. I learned them from pauses in conversation, from reports that ended abruptly, from the way certain officers avoided eye contact when specific areas were mentioned. I learned them from Eli Begay, though he never framed them as rules at all. Pay attention to what stays quiet, he told me once, as we watched the canyon shadow stretch across the road. Silence is usually earned. Inside the corridor, my phone confirmed what I already felt. No signal. Not even the flicker you sometimes get when the wind shifts just right. The GPS unit in the dash struggled too, the arrow drifting off the road, snapping back, then drifting again. According to the screen, I was driving in circles. According to my eyes, the path was straight. I keyed the mic and tried Lena again. Her response came through, but it sounded thin, distant, like she was speaking from the end of a long tunnel. She asked for an update. I told her what I could verify. Narrow passage, poor visibility, unstable comms. I didn't tell her about the time gaps or the way the radio seemed to hesitate before responding. Some things are contagious once spoken aloud. She didn't push, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Temporary assignment or not, she knew something was off. She reminded me that average response time in this district was over 40 minutes on a good day, longer at night. Backup wasn't coming quickly, even if we called for it. Out here, statistics look reassuring on paper and mean nothing in practice. That reality sat between us on the radio. unspoken but understood. Isolation isn't just about distance. It's about knowing that decisions you make now won't be corrected by someone else stepping in later. Whatever happened next would be ours to carry. The confessional weight of that settled in as I drove deeper. I realized how often I relied on structure to keep fear at bay. Checklists, protocols, clear chains of command. In this place, those things felt flimsy, like paper shields held up against stone. Lena asked if I wanted her to move closer. I hesitated, then told her to stay where she was until I confirmed a turnaround point. It was a safer call, and I hated myself for making it. Keeping her back meant bearing this alone a little longer. Bringing her forward meant sharing whatever waited ahead. The corridor curved, then narrowed again, walls closing in until I had to slow to avoid scraping the mirrors. The sound of the engine bounced strangely, echoing once, then not at all. I checked my mirrors out of habit and saw nothing but darkness behind me, as if the corridor had erased itself the moment I passed through. I thought about logging this later, about how I would phrase it to make it sound normal. Limited visibility. Signal degradation. The language of reports is designed to flatten experience, to make the extraordinary manageable. Even then, I knew parts of this would never be written down. The radio crackled softly, not enough to form words. I felt the urge to respond and forced myself not to. Another unspoken rule: don't answer unless you're sure who's calling. As the corridor began to widen, my headlights caught something that made me ease off the gas. At first, it looked like a trick of shadow. Then the shape resolved into something unmistakably human-made. A marker stood at the edge of the path. It wasn't a sign. No reflective surface, no lettering, no official seal. Just a vertical slab of stone set deliberately into the ground, its surface smooth on one side, rough on the other. It hadn't been carved by erosion. Someone had placed it there. I radioed Lena and told her I'd found something. She asked what kind of marker it was. I looked at the stone again, searching for an answer that fit procedure, that fit reason. I don't know, I said finally. The marker didn't belong to any agency I recognized. It wasn't on any map I'd seen. And standing there in the narrow canyon, I understood why the rules never taught mattered more than the ones written down. Because this was proof that someone had been here before us, long enough ago to know this place needed a warning, and careful enough not to explain it. I turned back toward the truck, aware that once I passed this marker, there would be no pretending this was just another call. Whatever lay beyond had already been acknowledged, quietly, by those who knew better than to say more. I got back behind the wheel, headlights catching the marker one last time before the curve swallowed it, and eased forward, knowing the next stretch would demand more than caution. It would demand a choice. I passed the marker slowly, half expecting something to change the moment it slipped out of view. Nothing did. That was almost worse. The canyon didn't react the way a living thing might when disturbed. It simply allowed me to continue, as if my presence had already been accounted for. The road ahead should have followed a gradual descent, the same way it always did in this section of canyon. I'd driven similar corridors dozens of times. But after the marker, the ground seemed to reconfigure itself in small, unsettling ways. The slope flattened where it should have dipped. A bend appeared earlier than memory allowed. I told myself erosion had altered the path, that storms could move more than people realize. Still, the sense that the land was rearranging itself around me refused to fade. Sound behaved even worse. When I eased on the brakes, the crunch of gravel echoed too long, stretching out as if the noise were being pulled down the canyon instead of bouncing back. When I shut off the engine to listen, the silence didn't settle naturally. It came in layers, each one closing over the last, until even my own breathing sounded intrusive. I took a few steps away from the truck, boots crunching softly, and called out once, just my location, spoken plainly, the way you're trained to do when visibility drops. My voice came back to me from the left, then again from behind, each echo slightly altered, not distorted enough to feel unreal, just wrong enough to make my skin tighten. I stopped calling out. The land wasn't reflecting sound anymore. It was redirecting it. Eli Begay's words surfaced without warning, the memory sharp and unwelcome. We'd been sitting in his Ranger truck years ago, watching dust clouds settle after storm. I'd asked him how he always seemed to know when to turn back. He'd smiled faintly and looked out at the canyon instead of at me. "Nothing out here chases," he said. "If it wants you, it lets you come to it." At the time, I'd assumed he meant exhaustion, dehydration, bad footing, the ordinary dangers officers and rangers learned to respect. Standing there now, surrounded by echoes that didn't behave in a road that wouldn't stay familiar, his meaning fell heavier. The radio clicked softly, not enough to form words. I lifted the mic, then stopped. Another unspoken rule pressed forward. Don't respond to fragments. Wait for clarity, even if waiting costs you. Lena checked it a moment later, her voice steady but tight. She asked if I'd reached the turnaround point yet. I told her I was still moving, still assessing. She reminded me that I wasn't obligated to push deeper, that the call itself hadn't stabilized. She was right. Every procedural argument favored retreat, but procedure doesn't account for patterns. Something was guiding me forward, not forcefully, not urgently. The land itself seemed to offer just enough reassurance to keep me moving. The road remained passable. The truck ran fine. Nothing overtly threatening revealed itself. If you've ever ignored a warning because it arrived quietly instead of loudly, you understand how dangerous that calm can be. I started the engine again and advanced at a crawl. The canyon widened briefly, opening into a shallow bowl littered with fallen rock. My headlights swept across a stone and caught movement where there shouldn't have been any. I froze, heart thudding, then realized it was just shadow sliding as clouds passed overhead. Just shadow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land was practicing, testing angles, adjusting. A sound reached me then, faint but distinct. Footsteps. Not crunching, not hurried. Measured. I turned, light snapping to the edge of the bowl, expecting to catch an animal or maybe Lena approaching from a different angle. No one was there. The footsteps continued anyway, circling the perimeter, always just outside the beam of my lights. When I took a step forward, they paused. When I stopped, they resumed. It wasn't pursuit. It was calibration. I keyed the radio and told Lena what I was hearing, choosing my words carefully. She listened without interrupting, then said she hadn't heard anything on her end. Her signal crackled, faded, then returned, as if the canyon itself were deciding how much of her voice to let through. "You want me to come down?" she asked. I pictured her headlights entering the space, her becoming another variable the land could work with. The thought tightened something in my chest. "Not yet," I said. "Hold where you are." The silence after that decision felt heavier than before. I realized how strained my connection to her had become, not just by distance, but by what I was choosing to carry alone. That was the real cost of these places. They isolate you from help long, before you're physically out of reach. The footsteps faded. In their place came something worse. My own radio traffic, replayed softly, like a memory muttering to itself. Snippets of my earlier transmissions drifted through the static, incomplete and out of order. Not words exactly. Impressions. I shut the radio off entirely. At the far edge of the bowl, half buried beneath a collapse of rock, my headlights caught something angular, not natural. I approached cautiously, clearing debris by hand until the shape emerged fully. It was a tool, or what remained of one. Stone, shaped deliberately, its edges worn smooth by time. Nearby, more fragments surfaced. Shards of work material, arranged in a pattern that suggested purpose, not accident. This wasn't recent. This wasn't ours. I knelt there, tracing the outline with my fingers, and understood the weight of it immediately. Centuries old, at least. Evidence that others had come here, had worked here, had known this place well enough to leave marks behind. The land hadn't changed to stop me. It had changed to lead me here. I stood slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the bowl, aware that whatever had used this place before me hadn't vanished. It had waited, and now I was standing where it once stood, holding proof that the canyon had been shaping human behavior long before badges and radios ever existed. The call that shouldn't exist suddenly made sense. Something didn't need to chase. It only needed to remember. I stayed crouched beside the fragments longer than I should have, my light fixed on the stone as if looking away might let it disappear. The pieces weren't arranged the way debris usually is. There was intention here. Spacing. Alignment. Whoever had shaped these tools hadn't dropped them. They had left them. I photographed everything, hands steady by habit even as my thoughts drifted. The scale didn't match anything I'd been trained to recognize. The stone was worked too precisely for its age. The wear patterns inconsistent with simple use. This wasn't a campsite. It wasn't ceremonial either, at least not in any way I understood. It felt functional, but the function didn't align with known history. I widened the search, moving carefully, scanning the ground instead of the walls. That was when I noticed the structure itself. The bowl wasn't natural. It had been modified, subtly enough to escape notice, unless you were looking for it. Stones had been cleared in a deliberate arc. The slope adjusted a funnel movement toward a central point. Water would have drained away cleanly here. Sound, too. This place had been designed to gather something. The logic behind it wasn't human, not entirely. Humans build for comfort, for shelter, for visibility. This structure prioritized control. Angles that redirected echoes. Walls that blocked sightlines while amplifying movement. Whoever shaped this space understood the canyon in a way that went beyond living in it. They used it. My radio stayed dark. I checked it anyway, thumb hovering over the power button, before I stopped myself. Silence felt safer than inviting another voice into this place. I took more photos, measured distances with pacing and landmarks, building a mental map that I wasn't sure I'd ever commit to paper. That was a conflict tightening in my chest. Every instinct as an officer told me this needed to be reported, documented, secured. This was an archaeological find, one that contradicted timelines and raised questions no one would like answering. But another instinct, older and quieter, told me that writing this down would be a mistake. I thought about Eli Begay again, about the way he'd warned me that some knowledge didn't want to travel. Naming things, cataloging them, pulled them into systems that couldn't respect their context. This land wasn't a crime scene. It was a witness, and witnesses don't always benefit from being interrogated. I refused to name what this place might have been, not out of fear, but out of respect. Names give shape, and shape invites possession. Whatever had been here before had taken care not to leave explanations. I wasn't about to undo that. The dread built slowly, the way pressure builds before a storm. Nothing moved. Nothing announced itself. The longer I stood there, the more aware I became of how completely I was being allowed to exist. No resistance. No warning. Just acceptance. That acceptance felt wrong. I stepped back toward the truck, eyes scanning the edges of the bowl. The canyon walls seemed closer than before, their surfaces catching less light. Shadows deepened, overlapping until depth perception blurred. I felt suddenly exposed, like standing in the center of a room where every door had been quietly closed. I keyed the radio once, briefly, just to hear something human. Static answered, then cut out entirely. No return. No echo. The system wasn't failing anymore. It was absent. I considered retreating, marking the location mentally and leaving before curiosity became liability. That would have been the smart choice. Instead, I circled the bowl one last time, driven by a need to understand just enough to justify walking away. At the far end, partially concealed by rockfall, I found the final piece. A vertical surface, smoothed deliberately, carved into the canyon wall itself. Time had softened its edges, but the markings remained. Lines, intersecting at irregular intervals, forming a pattern that didn't repeat but felt cohesive. Not language, not art, instruction. I didn't touch it. Standing there, I realized how old this was. Older than patrol routes, older than borders, older than the idea that this land could be owned or managed. Whatever had shaped this place had done so patiently, without urgency, confident that the canyon would preserve its work. My presence here felt like an interruption. The air shifted subtly, not with wind, but with absence. Sound drained away first. The faint hum of insects vanished. The distant whisper of air through rock faded until there was nothing left but the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. Even that seemed too loud. I froze, every sense straining for input that didn't come. This was silence unlike any I'd known. Not the quiet of night, not the calm of isolation. This was silence imposed, pressed down until the world felt padded, distant. I backed away slowly, eyes never leaving the carved wall. The silence followed me, expanding, filling the bowl, wrapping around the truck when I reached it. When I closed the door, the sound of the latch felt muffled, like it had traveled through water. I sat there, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, listening to nothing. The canyon had stopped responding entirely. No echoes, no radio, no wind, just a way of a place that had revealed itself enough to warn me, and then withdrawn, leaving me alone with the knowledge that something here had been built, used, and abandoned on purpose. I started the engine only after the silence became unbearable, the sound shattering the stillness in a way that felt like trespass. As the headlights cut back across stone, the bowl looked ordinary again, its unnatural geometry swallowed by shadow. But the silence lingered, clinging to the cab as I turned the truck around. Whatever this place was, it had shown me what it wanted me to see, and it was done. I turned the truck around because staying felt impossible, not because leaving felt safe. The engine sounded too loud in the canyon, the vibration carrying farther than it should have, as if the rock itself were listening again. The silence from the bowl didn't lift when I pulled away. It followed, clinging to the cab, pressing against my ears until every sound felt slightly delayed. I hadn't gone far when the radio powered itself back on. There was no crackle first, no warning tone, just a voice, clear enough to make my chest tighten. It said my name the way Lena did when she needed confirmation, professional but edged with concern. Same rhythm, same breath pattern, same pause before the last syllable. I answered without thinking. The reply came immediately, too immediately, repeating my response back to me, not as an echo, but as a correction, like someone testing how closely they could match me. I shut the radio off again, heart hammering, and told myself this was stress, exhaustion, adrenaline misfiring. But the sense of presence returned, heavier now, no longer patient, not hostile either. Curious. The corridor ahead narrowed faster than it had on the way in. The walls felt closer, though I knew they hadn't moved. My headlights caught movement at the edge of the beam, not a shape, just displacement, like air folding around something solid that refused to show itself. Then Lena screamed. It came through the radio in a burst of static, sharp enough to make me flinch. I slammed the brakes and grabbed the mic, calling her name over and over. Her response came fragmented, words cutting in and out, but one thing was clear. She was no longer on a rim road. She didn't remember leaving it. Her GPS had failed. Her headlights were reflecting off rock on all sides. She described a corridor that matched mine too closely to be coincidence. Whatever had guided me here had reached for her too, using familiarity as leverage. Protocol vanished in that moment. I didn't think about jurisdiction or backup or containment. I thought about distance, about how long it would take me to reach her if I pushed the truck harder than I should, about how alone she sounded beneath the distortion. The voice came back then, not from the radio, but from somewhere in the canyon itself. It sounded like Lena calling my name, closer than she should have been. The direction was wrong. I knew it was wrong. Still, my body reacted before my mind could catch up, turning my head toward it, searching. That was a mistake. The presence pressed in not physically, but perceptually. Memories surfaced uninvited. Brief flashes of past calls, old patrol routes, Eli Begay's face in the rear-view mirror. Not images exactly. Impressions layered over the present, blurring edges until I couldn't tell which sensations belonged to now. It never showed itself. There was no shape to describe, no feature to fix in memory. It announced itself through alignment, through perfect imitation that stopped just short of being flawless. Each repetition was closer, more accurate, like it was learning in real time. I forced myself to focus on Lena's breathing over the radio, anchoring to something real. I told her to stop moving, to shut off her engine, to stay exactly where she was. She said she could hear footsteps circling her vehicle, slow and deliberate, matching her own movements when she shifted in her seat. I broke protocol then, in a way that still weighs on me. I gave her instructions I had never been authorized to give, directions that weren't on any map. I told her to follow my voice only, to ignore anything else, even if it sounded exactly like me, especially if it did. As I drove, the canyon fought back quietly. The road dipped and rose unpredictably, forcing me to slow, stretching the distance between us. The voice mimicked Lena again, this time pleading, using phrases she said earlier in the night, moments it shouldn't have had access to. I didn't respond. I spoke only when Lena spoke, overlapping her words to keep the cadence broken, refusing to give the presence a clean sample to work with. When I reached her, I didn't see her at first. Her headlights were off. Her vehicle sat at an angle against the rock wall, door ajar. I jumped out, weapon drawn more out of instinct than intent, scanning a darkness that felt crowded despite being empty. She was halfway out of the cab, frozen, eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back without asking permission. The moment we crossed the threshold between her vehicle and mine, the pressure eased, like a line had been crossed that it wouldn't follow. The canyon went still again. Lena shook violently as we drove, shock setting in now that movement had stopped. She kept asking what it was, what she'd heard, why it sounded like both of us at once. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Any explanation felt like invitation. The consequences didn't wait. Lena transferred out within a week. Officially, it was stress. Unofficially, she stopped sleeping, stopped trusting her senses. She avoided narrow spaces, avoided radios, avoided silence most of all. As for me, I carried it differently. The mimicry didn't follow me home, but the awareness did. The understanding that something out there didn't need to reveal itself to be effective. It only needed access to voices, to memory, to the rules we trust to keep us oriented. We retreated together, headlights pointed outward, neither of us speaking until the canyon finally released us back into open land. Even then, I didn't feel relief, just distance. Behind us, the corridor closed without sound, swallowing the road as if it had never existed. I didn't look back, not because I was afraid to see it again, but because I knew it had already seen enough of me. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The road widened, the sky opened, and the radio began behaving like a radio again, but neither of us reached for it. Whatever had happened in the canyon didn't dissolve just because the land released us. It rode with us, quiet and heavy, settling into the spaces we weren't ready to acknowledge. The debriefing came the next morning. It was held in a small room with bad acoustics and a flickering fluorescent light, the kind of place where details go to flatten out. A supervisor asked routine questions. Time of call, coordinates, weather conditions, equipment issues. I answered each one carefully, choosing language that stayed within the boundaries of what could be processed. Signal interference, disorientation, terrain hazards. Nothing about voices that didn't belong to radios. Nothing about roads that rearranged themselves. Nothing about something learning us as we moved through it. The truth didn't fit the format, and forcing it would have turned the debriefing into something else entirely, an argument about credibility instead of a record of events. Lena sat beside me, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the table. When she spoke, her answers were shorter than mine, precise, controlled. I recognized the effort it took to keep them that way. She never contradicted me, never added details that would raise questions. We were aligned without having discussed it, united by the unspoken understanding that saying more would not help either of us. The report was filed. The call was marked unresolved. The location was flagged for future assessment, a phrase vague enough to mean nothing would happen anytime soon. Within a week, Lena was reassigned. Officially, it was temporary, a rotation meant to give her breathing room after a stressful incident. Unofficially, it was an exit ramp. She stopped responding to my messages shortly after. A month later, I heard through someone else that she'd put in her notice. She didn't leave law enforcement immediately. She tried another department, another environment. It didn't take. Radios made her tense. Narrow hallways made her dizzy. Silence made her restless. The job relies on trust, in equipment, in partners, in your own perception. Once that trust fractures, it's almost impossible to rebuild. I carried a different fracture. Guilt settled in first. Not guilt for breaking protocol. I'd do that again without hesitation. Guilt for bringing her into it at all. For answering that first call. For assuming experience would protect me. Moral injury doesn't announce itself loudly. It seeps in, undermining certainty one decision at a time. I replayed the night constantly, searching for a point where a different choice might have changed the outcome. Turning back at the marker, waiting for backup that would have arrived too late to matter. Ignoring a call that felt wrong from the start. None of those scenarios resolved cleanly. They just shifted the burden somewhere else. A few weeks later, I drove out to see Eli Begay. He lived in a small house near the edge of the reservation, far enough from town to feel intentional. When I told him I'd been in the Western Canyon corridor, he didn't ask why. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting that sentence eventually. I didn't give him details. I didn't need to. He listened anyway, eyes on the horizon, hands folded loosely in his lap. When I finished, he waited a long time before speaking. Knowing changes your responsibilities. He said, finally, not knowing lets you pretend. I asked him if I should have reported more, if silence made me complicit. He considered that, then shook his head. Some truths don't ask permission, he said. They arrive when they arrive. Your job isn't to carry them everywhere. It's to decide where they don't belong. That was the closest he came to reassurance. The guilt didn't disappear after that, but it shifted. It became less about what I'd done wrong and more about what I'd learned. Knowledge, once acquired, doesn't leave quietly. It demands accommodation. I found myself adjusting patrol routes subconsciously, steering away from certain canyons without consciously deciding to. I avoided night shifts near the Western District when I could, volunteering for paperwork instead. Sleep became inconsistent. Dreams replayed fragments of sound, voices almost familiar, pauses too long to be natural. I woke up more than once with the sensation that I was being listened to, even in my own home. Not watched, listened to. I stopped talking about the incident entirely. Not because I was ordered to, but because every attempt felt like erosion. Each retelling smoothed the edges, made it easier to dismiss, easier to forget why it mattered. Silence preserved the weight of it. Months passed. The land stayed quiet. No new calls came from that corridor. No hikers wandered into it. No reports surfaced that forced the issue. On paper, the canyon returned to being just another remote area with low activity. Statistically insignificant, operationally irrelevant. But silence doesn't mean absence. It means restraint. I understood then that the cost of knowing isn't paid all at once. It's paid in small adjustments, in the way you choose words, in the routes you avoid, in the people you don't follow into places that feel wrong, even when you can't explain why. If you ever felt the urge to look away from something because acknowledging it would demand change, you understand that cost. Some truths don't ask permission, and once they're known, they expect something in return. The canyon didn't reach out again. It didn't need to. It had tested, observed, and withdrawn, confident that the lesson would hold. The land returned to silence, the patient kind that doesn't signal danger, but doesn't promise safety either. That silence settled back into the canyons, deep and unbroken, as if nothing had happened at all. And that, more than anything else, is how I knew it wasn't finished. The silence that followed didn't feel like closure. It felt like a pause in conversation, the kind where both sides are deciding what can safely be said next. Life resumed its shape around me. Shifts, calls, paperwork. But something underneath had shifted permanently, like a fault line settling after an earthquake. I noticed the first inconsistency a month later. I was reviewing old reports from the Western District, looking for an unrelated reference, when I realized one of my own logs no longer matched my memory. The call Idaho was still there, but the timestamps had changed. The duration shortened. The coordinates simplified, rounded off to a broader area that no longer pointed to the corridor. There was no revision note, no signature. At first, I assumed it was a clerical correction. Systems update, data migration, Things like that happen more often than people realize. But when I pulled Lena's associated entry, it was gone entirely. Not archived, not flagged, just absent, as if it had never been filed. I checked backups. Same result. That was when I started looking deeper. I combed through years of reports tied to canyons west of Black Mesa, focusing on calls marked unresolved, abandoned, or reassigned mid-response. The pattern emerged slowly, not through repetition, but through omission. Reports that ended abruptly. Follow-ups that never materialized. Coordinates that shifted slightly from one document to the next, drifting just far enough to avoid clustering. None of the changes were dramatic. That was the point. Big edits attract attention. Small ones dissolve into background. I noticed, too, that the unofficial exclusion zone had expanded, though no memo announced it. Patrol routes were adjusted quietly. New officers were steered away from certain areas under the guise of efficiency. Low call volume. Difficult access. Better use of resources elsewhere. On paper, it looked like optimization. In reality, it was avoidance. The statistics backed it up, or at least appeared to. Incident counts in the Western Canyon District dropped sharply over a 10-year span. Response times improved on average, not because officers were faster, but because fewer calls were being acknowledged at all. If you don't log the problem, the numbers improve automatically. I recognize the tactic because I participated in it without realizing. By choosing what to write down and what to flatten into generalities, I'd help create the illusion that nothing was happening out there anymore. That realization isolated me more than the canyon ever had. I started to see the pattern stretching back decades. Older reports referenced landmarks that no longer appeared on maps. Veteran officers mentioned places in passing that younger ones had never heard of. Certain names surfaced repeatedly in connection with early retirements, lateral transfers, unexplained leaves of absence. Eli Begay's name appeared more than once, not prominently, just enough to notice. I drove out to see him again, needing confirmation that this wasn't paranoia taking root. He listened as before, quietly without interruption. When I told what I'd found, the missing signatures, the softened coordinates, the expanding silence, he didn't seem surprised. It's easier to erase than to explain, he said, especially when explaining invites attention. I asked him who was responsible. Administration? Federal agencies? Tribal leadership? He shook his head. Doesn't matter, he said. Systems do this on their own once enough people agree not to look too closely. That answer didn't bring comfort. It removed the possibility of accountability. You can't confront a habit. You can only decide whether to participate. Back at work, I felt the isolation sharpen. Conversations with colleagues stayed surface level. When someone mentioned the Western Canyons, voices lowered instinctively. Topics changed. New officers didn't ask questions because they didn't know there were questions to ask. That was how the gap sustained itself. I stopped sharing my findings. Not because I was told to, but because every attempt ended the same way. Polite nods, careful deflections, the subtle signaling that continuing would be unwelcome. The institution wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. That was more effective. At night, I replayed the implications. If this pattern spanned decades, then whatever we'd encountered wasn't new. It wasn't escalating. It wasn't random. It had settled into a rhythm that people had learned to accommodate. That thought disturbed me more than the encounter itself. The land didn't need secrecy. We provided it. I considered filing a formal complaint, forcing the issue into daylight. But daylight doesn't always disinfect. Sometimes it provokes. Sometimes it draws the wrong kind of attention to places that have already demonstrated how well they listen. Eli's words echoed again. Some truths don't ask permission. I wonder whether erasure was the land's doing or ours, whether the canyon exerted influence directly, or whether humans, uncomfortable with uncertainty, had built a system that mirrored its behavior, redirecting, softening, removing anything that resisted explanation. The isolation became a choice then, not just a condition. I could continue digging, compiling evidence no one wanted, or I could stop, preserving what I knew without spreading it. Neither option felt clean. In the end, I chose silence. Not the permanent kind, Not the kind born of fear. The temporary kind. The pause before a necessary conversation. I stopped searching records. I stopped cross-referencing. I let the paper trail fade where it wanted to fade. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. I understood now that the cost of knowing included restraint. Knowing when to act and when to wait. The land had demonstrated patience on a scale humans rarely match. If it could wait centuries, I could wait a little longer. The erasures remained. The exclusion zone continued to expand invisibly. The statistics told a cleaner story with each passing year. And I held my silence, not because the truth was gone, but because it wasn't ready to be carried any farther yet. Some things survive precisely because they are allowed to remain unfinished. For now, that was enough. Silence can only be held for so long before it starts to change shape. What began as restraint slowly turned into something heavier, something that pressed inward instead of outward. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, the right reason. But time has a way of eroding those excuses. Eventually, you're left with a simple question. Are you protecting others or just protecting yourself? This isn't a revelation. I'm not telling you this to uncover a mystery or to invite anyone to go looking. If anything, it's the opposite. This is a warning, offered too late to help me, but maybe early enough to help someone else recognize the shape of danger before it names itself. There's a responsibility that comes with wearing a badge in a place like this. And it doesn't end when you turn it in. You're not just enforcing laws. You're standing between systems that want clarity and land that doesn't offer it freely. Cultural responsibility isn't about repeating stories or claiming understanding. It's about knowing when not to intrude, when curiosity becomes disrespect, when documentation becomes disturbance. What happened in that canyon didn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the land that shaped it and the people who learned, over generations, how to live without provoking it. That's why I won't name what we encountered. Names make things searchable. Searchable things get chased. Chased things stop waiting. There are places that should never be searched for, not because they're hidden, but because they're patient. The canyon didn't lure us with secrets. It didn't promise answers. It responded to presence, to movement, to attention. It used what we brought with us, voices, habits, memory, and reflected them back until we understood how exposed we were. I've had years to sit with that understanding. At first, I was angry at the system for smoothing over what couldn't be explained, angry at myself for complying, angry at the land for not caring whether we were ready. Anger feels productive, but it burns out quickly when there's no clear target. What replaced it was something quieter, acceptance maybe, or humility, the realization that not everything encountered is meant to be resolved. Some experiences aren't lessons with clean conclusions. They're boundaries. I thought often about Lena, about how close she came to being lost, not physically, but in a way that's harder to recover from. I thought about Eli Begay and the patience in his warnings, the way he never tried to convince, only to prepare. For a long time, those thoughts carried guilt. Then, slowly, they shifted toward responsibility. I couldn't undo what happened. I couldn't restore what was erased. But I could choose how the knowledge settled in me. I could refuse to turn it into spectacle. I could refuse to turn it into proof. If you've ever felt the pull to dig into something simply because it resists explanation, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from that search. Ask what you're willing to carry afterward. Some truths don't ask permission, but they do demand care once they arrive. That's the hidden cost people don't talk about. Knowing changes you in ways that aren't visible from the outside. It alters how you listen, how you trust your senses, how you move through quiet places. Over time, you learn that restraint isn't weakness. It's respect practiced daily. I left law enforcement a few years after that night. Not because I was forced out, and not because I lost faith in the work. I left because my relationship to uncertainty had changed. I no longer needed authority to justify caution. I carried it naturally. Sometimes I drive near the Western Canyon still, but I don't enter them. I don't slow down for long looks. I acknowledge the land the way you acknowledge someone who has already made their position clear, with distance, with consistency. If you're listening to this because you're curious, I understand that instinct. Curiosity is how we learn. But if you're listening because something in your own experience felt familiar, a place that didn't behave the way it should, a moment where reality seemed to hesitate, then listen closely to what that discomfort is telling you. You don't need confirmation. You don't need validation. And you don't need to push further just to be sure. That's why I'm telling you this now. Not to illuminate the canyon, but to leave it in shadow where it belongs. Not to invite investigation, but to encourage discernment. Some boundaries exist for reasons that only become clear once they're crossed. The land doesn't threaten. It doesn't warn loudly. It waits. It watched generations come and go before any of us arrived with radios and maps and confidence. It will watch long after those tools fail. The canyon doesn't need attention to persist. It needs distance. Even now, as I speak, I'm careful about what I recall and what I leave untouched. Memory can be a form of presence, too. I've learned to let certain details blur, to allow silence to do its work, because the land is still there, watching, waiting, and it has all the time it needs. I'm retired now. The badge sits in a drawer I rarely open, wrapped in a cloth to keep it from tarnishing. I didn't leave with ceremony or speeches. I handed in my equipment, signed the paperwork, and drove home along the same roads I patrolled for years, aware that I was crossing an invisible line of my own. Distance changes how memory behaves. Some details sharpen with time, others soften, edges rounding off until they feel almost safe to touch. What happened in that canyon did neither. It stayed intact. Preserved the way stone preserves footprints when conditions are right. Not vivid, not blurred, just there. Retirement gave me space to notice the consequences I've been carrying without naming. They show up in small ways. I don't camp in narrow places anymore. I avoid slot canyons, even the popular ones with clear signage and handrails. When I drive at night, I keep the radio low. Silence still feels charged, like it's waiting for something to slip through. Dreams come and go, not nightmares exactly, more like fragments. Corridors that don't quite connect. Voices that almost resolve into meaning before dissolving. I wake up with a sense that I've missed something important, though I can never say what. By morning, the feeling fades, leaving behind a quiet tension that hums beneath the day. Absence is another consequence. There are people I no longer see, places I no longer visit, conversations I no longer have. Not because I'm afraid, but because I understand limits now. Knowing where not to go is a form of wisdom that doesn't announce itself. I've had years to think about what I would share if I ever spoke again. I knew there would only be one rule worth mentioning, and even that one would have to remain incomplete. Full instructions invite misuse. Partial ones invite caution. Here it is, as much as I'm willing to give. If the land answers you in a voice you recognize, stop. That's all. No explanation. No guarantee. Just that. I won't tell you what to do next, because context matters, and context can't be transferred cleanly. What matters is recognizing the moment when familiarity becomes a tool instead of a comfort. When something uses what you trust to draw you further than you intended to go. I don't regret going into that canyon. Regret assumes there was a better version of events waiting if I'd chosen differently. I don't believe that. I believe the encounter was inevitable once certain lines were crossed, and that our survival depended less on preparation than on restraint. There's a temptation, especially after time has passed, to frame experiences like this as lessons learned. That framing suggests closure, a neat arc that ends with understanding. This didn't end that way. It simply stopped, like a conversation interrupted, leaving meaning suspended in the air. I've never returned to that corridor. I don't know if it still exists in the same way. Landscapes change. Systems adapt. Silence moves. But I know better than to test whether patience has limits. People ask sometimes if I miss the job. I tell them I miss the people, the sense of purpose, the moments where you know you made a difference. I don't tell them about the weight that comes with knowing some calls aren't meant to be resolved, only survived. This isn't meant to frighten you. Fear is loud and temporary. Respect is quiet and enduring. What I'm offering is neither instruction nor invitation. It's acknowledgement. There are boundaries in this world that don't announce themselves with signs or fences. They exist because something on the other side has already decided how close is too close. When those boundaries are crossed, the response isn't always immediate. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it waits until you're invested enough to listen. I think about the land often, not with suspicion, but with a kind of recognition. It doesn't care whether we understand it. It doesn't need witnesses. It continues according to rules that predate our attempts to categorize and control. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Pay attention to hesitation, to moments when progress feels encouraged but certainty does not, to places where your tools work just well enough to keep you moving, but not well enough to keep you oriented. That's where the warning lives. I've said all I'm going to say, not because there's nothing more, but because adding more would turn this into something it was never meant to be. Some stories end not with answers, but with distance. The land doesn't need you to believe in it. It doesn't need you to remember it either. It will continue to exist whether you listen or not, shaping itself around time, waiting for attention to wander its way again. If you ever find yourself somewhere quiet enough that your own thoughts feel out of place, trust that feeling. Step back. Choose another path. Let silence remain what it is. And if a familiar voice calls to you from a place that should know your name, don't answer.